Early signing day for the 2025 class is in the books. It is now Thursday, December 5th, and a lot of the dust has settled in terms of the high school recruiting, at least in terms of the higher end FBS programs. I'm Jarrett Roser. He's Sam Spiegelman. This is Louisiana versus All Recruit That Boot. And we wanted to take some time and kind of recap how some things went for the in-state programs at the FBS level: LSU, Louisiana out there in Lafayette, Louisiana Tech, Tulane, and ULM. Still a lot to be determined for the FCS program, so we won't talk as much about them. And then obviously a really big fish in this Louisiana class headed elsewhere, and Jahkeem Stewart making his decision public to go to USC. And so we'll hit on all of that. Sam, how are we feeling now that the madness of another signing day is over and it's Thursday, and we can kind of look back at it after the chaos of the past few days and past couple weeks?
The drama is not over. There's a couple of still lingering storylines, but obviously the bulk of the 2025 class is now behind us. I would say this, as eventful of an early signing period or national signing day, whatever you want to call it, was, the weeks leading into it have only added to the intensity. Obviously, from the LSU angle, but really across the country, the amount of flips, changing of decisions late, whether it's second or third flips. I had someone who's very plugged in say they've never seen a landscape like this. So November through, before, leading into, and then after Thanksgiving was absolutely a torrential downpour. Signing day brought some more, but if I'm not so happy that it's already Thursday and we're one step closer to the weekends, and Tuesday I got a flight to MSY, I got no complaints, Jarrett.
You mentioned it feeling different, the landscape. Brian Kelly talked about it some. He said it felt more like tax day than signing day because of how much is now hyper-focused on the financial piece of the conversation, which I think we've talked about it before on here. Money in recruiting, I mean, I don't know if anyone wants to clutch the pearls, but that's not a new dynamic. But it is certainly drastically changed in the last few years, where the NIL process and the upcoming revenue sharing dynamics have brought in a level of legitimacy that brings in bigger money and makes those numbers go up per kid exponentially. And so it can swing things more abruptly than ever and become more of a single-handed piece of the decision than ever before. And it's made it that much tougher to have a handle, from my perspective. Correct me if you feel differently, but to have a strong handle on, okay, this guy is heading here down the stretch, because there are 10 to 20 programs that those numbers can get so big in the snap of a finger that it can drastically alter something at the last minute. And I don't know if that's fun. I understand why it's frustrating for a program like an LSU that is typically a perennial power in the recruiting game, but now finds itself a little shy. It's still in the ballpark, but a little shy of where some of these other programs can go. When you look at how much the money is now impacting this, I mean, what is your takeaway on what we're looking at and how much of a shift we've seen in terms of that landscape you mentioned?
Yeah, you can look at LSU's class, and they still finished or are on track with the number 6 class in the country. Not too shabby, considering where they are on the spectrum for NILs and collectives and whatnot. Listen, there's always drama in recruiting. As long as I've been doing this, there's been room for fireworks, late, early, in the middle. Anytime there's an opportunity for chaos to ensue. With the opportunities available through NIL, the programs that you're referring to, I believe that, in the past, sometimes visits, sometimes relationships with coaches, sometimes connections to a school would be the catalyst to a flip. If LSU is able to get, prospect B on campus, for that late visit, for the Oklahoma game, now they're going to have a chance to flip him. What you're seeing now is schools don't actually have to get you on campus. They might have a connection to the kid. They might have a connection to the coach, but they have a new weapon in the form of NIL to entice somebody. So you can really flip a recruitment without the legs that it used to carry. So that's opened the door for a little bit more of unpredictable chaos. Like I said, it can be fun, especially if you're on a fan of one of those programs that can create a really opportunistic NIL deal. And it could also, the converse can be true. If you're LSU and you lost Bryce Underwood down the stretch and Devin Harper down the stretch, or Notre Dame and you lost Deuce Knight, who was committed for 13 months to Auburn, and then Ole Miss was in the mix. It's just the product of recruiting in 2024 for, and probably indefinitely. But it's always been there. The chaos factor is always alive in recruiting. That is what makes it fun. What makes it less fun, I think, for fans is the reasons why. That ace recruiter on Auburn's staff, or the it factor when you step foot at Death Valley, for a big game. That's still there. It's just to a lesser degree, with the NIL factor also being very real and very legitimate.
And all this said, and all the concerns about where LSU is in terms of the spending game and the difficulties to match some schools in Texas or South Florida or the West Coast or a Michigan, obviously, with Bryce Underwood. When I look at this class, you mentioned number 6 for y'all, I think number 8 in the On3 composite rankings. It's still a very good class that I like an awful lot. And you would love if Bryce Underwood was a part of it. You would love if Cade Phillips was a part of it. And, a couple of these other guys, those are certainly the two that stand out at two really critical positions and two really highly ranked guys. But what was your impression of this overall class, the guys that are now signed to come to campus, many of them in just a month, but certainly, as part of this class, because I think it's a phenomenal class that sets them up to, we'll see what happens in the transfer portal over the next month, but sets them up to really have a chance to be a national contender if they follow through with this next phase of it. This is a class that has them in that conversation.
Listen, before the NIL era, and especially after, the biggest emphasis for schools, especially schools like LSU, I would say schools like South Carolina fit this bill, and Auburn, and eventually Alabama, is trying to keep the best players in the state. And what LSU did, for the most part, was able to put their fence around the boot, which is always going to be the case when you have a staff that Brian Kelly has assembled. These are a bunch of all-stars with Louisiana ties. And that's been the goal since Les Miles was there, since Coach Orgeron was there, and especially under Coach Kelly and his staff. And we talked about the two of the best running backs in the country are en route to LSU. That was a major position of need for this roster. Harlem Berry is the most electric player in Louisiana. He's my number one player in Louisiana. And JT Lindsey has had one of, if not the best senior year of any running back in the country out of Alexandria. You know that better than anyone. I think they missed on quarterback, but there's still hope for Bryce Baker. Joe Sloan has dialed into a top 100 quarterback who's having his own commitment issues. We're expecting a decision potentially next week. He's also considering Penn State and trying to wait to see who UNC hires. He's been committed to UNC for 18 months. The receivers, obviously a lot of attrition, losing Derek Meadows to Alabama, which was expected. I think they're going to need to go to the portal for receivers. I think they finished extremely strong up front. Brad Davis is always a power player, even after losing Devin Harper, which is one of the toughest losses in this class, to hold on to Tyler Miller despite a very fierce push from Ole Miss, and flip interior offensive lineman Solomon Thomas, a 5-star. Listen, you want to keep Devin Harper in the state. We've both seen him play. That's a guy you want blocking for JT Lindsey and Harlem Berry and Caden Durham. To get Solomon Thomas to flip, it kind of cools that loss just a little bit. There's some great additions on the defensive line, a fantastic linebacker core, being able to hold off A&M for Keelan, sign CJ Ross, reclassify Zach Weeks and bring him on board, keep Jaden Breaker despite Georgia and Alabama chipping away. Losing Cade Phillips sucks. Of course, he's an extremely talented cornerback from the Houston area, but you signed Aiden Anding, you signed Jacob Bradford, you have these in-state pieces. At least you have a very strong foundation if you want to add potentially a quarterback, potentially a defensive lineman, potentially a DB, and potentially a receiver in the transfer portal. And all of a sudden, that class looks pretty damn good.
You have guys, honestly, from my understanding, and keeping tight tabs on this is challenging. But you have guys in this class that certainly got money, high-end guys that are getting money, have deals set up, but had bigger opportunities elsewhere on the financial side of things, but wanted to be a part of this LSU class and so locked in and are going to try to make the most of both the money they can make now at LSU as well as the development that they feel like sets them up for the next level. And we talked more just now about some of those in-state guys, but you were able to compete wherever those numbers ended up behind the scenes. You were able to go out there and keep DJ Pickett despite everything else happening, other opportunities for him elsewhere. And you mentioned flipping Solomon Thomas. Those are two of the top prospects in the country that you were able to pull in from out of state, and some other great out of state guys for sure. But those two particularly top end guys that you win huge national scale battles with. I'm really encouraged just by the job that the staff has done, the direction that the program has taken in this new era to be able to match and not only be close in some of those battles, but win some of those battles down the stretch. I think there's a lot to be really positive about here on Thursday morning in that regard.
Yeah, you're telling me that Joe Sloan isn't going to be able to find a quarterback, whether it's Bryce Baker or in the portal. You're telling me that Cortez Hankton isn't going to be able to find a playmaking receiver, either in the transfer portal or down the road. You're telling me that Bo Davis isn't going to find another piece. They already found a lot of depth to add to this class. If they're looking for another edge defender, I trust those guys. And Corey Raymond proving his value. DJ Pickett was the most coveted cornerback in America. Not only did Miami make a push, Florida, which has flipped, I believe, 12 or 13 players since before Thanksgiving, made a serious run. He is from Zephyr Hills, which is about a stone's throw away from Gainesville, to keep both of those in-state schools at bay. Show me those Corey Raymond doubters. Come on. Listen, I know it stings to lose Cade Phillips. It was a big get for Corey to flip him from Texas to begin with. It's hard to pull kids from Texas when Texas and A&M are playing at this high of a clip. To go into Florida and do that from Miami and UF, that also speaks volumes.
You have anything else you want to say about the LSU class, whether it be a kid you think is going to surprise some folks, maybe, exceed rankings expectations, or a position group that particularly stands out? We hit on a couple there. I think Corey did a great job with the secondary. I love the offensive line group that came in. Obviously, a lot of focus on the defensive side of the ball at every level with some of the defensive linemen and linebackers and DBs that have come in. You talked a little bit about the running back duo that I'm just more excited about every time I watch those guys play football this year as seniors. But do you have anyone you want to shout out that maybe we didn't talk as much about yet?
Yeah, I'm sitting here knocking their wide receiver class, but listen, it wasn't a difficult recruitment to get Teron Francis on board. He's been probably the longest tenured commit, if not in the top group. Listen, he's been spectacular as a senior. He's been spectacular since he was a freshman at Carr. The biggest issue with Teron is being able to be consistently productive. And he's going to go to LSU where he's going to get an upgraded quarterback and in the surrounding cast naturally by playing in the SEC. And I think he offers that upside of any top receiver in the country. He's physically gifted. He tests out the water. And I think under Cortez Hankton's coaching, I think the consistency will eventually get there. And then also a guy that we never talk about on the offensive line, Brett Bordelon, the longest tenured commitment. In fact, I actually got a reminder on my phone. He committed about 2 years ago. I remember being at AT&T Stadium for Texas State Championships, and Brett goes, "I'm about to commit." And I said, "Let's do it, bud." Listen, his brother had a lot more doubters coming out of Newman. He was a little bit skinnier. Wasn't sure if he was going to play tackle, guard, or center. And Bo has turned into be a force on that LSU offensive line. Brett has been even more decorated coming out of Newman. It sucks the way his high school career came to an end, being injured on the sidelines late. But he's someone who's going to be a 2 or 3 year starter on that offensive line. And we talk about the sting of losing a Devin Harper, but you hold on to Tyler Miller, you flip Solomon Thomas, and you have a I feel like just a sure thing in Brett Bordelon, who has been so great as a senior. He's been great since he was a sophomore at Newman. And I just think that offensive line, as much as we've been crushing them for some of the attrition, is still in pretty good shape under Brad Davis's watch.
O-line is a position group that I'm more excited about in this class than I think has gotten necessarily its attention, because it's not always the flashiest or sexiest out there in terms of how much media attention it gets. But Carius Kearney up there in Arkansas, Tyler Miller, a guy that I was worried about, Solomon Thomas, you mentioned Brett Bordelon and just the stability there. And you hit on an aspect that I wanted to kind of wrap up with this LSU class. As much attention gets paid down the stretch to who may or may not be coming or going from a class, guys that are committed for a really long time end up becoming sort of part of the back burner, and you start to take them for granted and not think about them as much as fans. But you mentioned Brett and Tehran, another guy who was committed last November, right before their semifinal game. Keelan Moses is someone that I think started to be kind of taken for granted in a lot of ways down the stretch of his recruiting process. And whatever you thought he was going to be, whatever you think he can be, whatever your assessment is of where he is as a player and a prospect, I think he's gotten to a point where he went from being super hyped as an underclassman to almost being underappreciated at this point to what he does bring to that defensive group, because we've seen the way when he's able to pin back and get after opposing backfields, whether passers or running back, he is someone that can really disrupt a lot for the entirety of a game. And so I think having him as a piece of that really good linebacker crew with some of those out-of-state guys that you mentioned, he's someone that I think, again, because he's been committed for so long and people kind of took for granted he was coming, he's kind of been taken for granted a little bit in terms of some of the conversation. And I'm excited to see him now in purple and gold at the next level.
Yeah, Blake Baker did a fantastic job of getting 4 really talented linebackers with differing skill sets and talents to come in. And someone like Jaden Breaker, who's 6'4" and 215 plus pounds, has the same sort of length and motor as a Caleb Chason did back in the day. And I could see him, pinning his ears back and being a pass rusher. We have already seen Zach Weeks do that at different times for Oconee County over there in Georgia. We know what the Weeks bring to the linebacking core. He can drop back and get after the quarterback. Him and Keelan and CJ Ross are potentially 3-down linebackers with speed, power, instincts. And then you throw a Jaden Breaker in there, who I think one of the more underrated commits, even though he's now in the top 100 for rivals. Just an absolute difference maker who's just scratching the surface. So plenty of talent coming to Baton Rouge, and more to probably come in the next couple of weeks with the portal.
Looking at some of the FBS schools that, the non-LSU FBS schools around the state, Tulane announced 15 additions on Wednesday, including a guy that we've talked about an awful lot, Josh Lewis, who had kind of trended that way since backing off of the Missouri commitment. He was at that regular season finale against Memphis, and you could see, I thought he was committing that night, and he very well may have, and just not made it public until Wednesday morning. But the excitement and affection between he and that coaching staff was pretty evident that night. But he ends up being kind of the late addition, at least from the in-state guys that I keep an eye on, to another, I think, solid class. You saw some of the Alabama ties come into play with staff members that are coming from Troy and South Alabama and whatnot. They dipped into Alabama for some key pieces. But when you look at that Tulane class, if there's a certain prospect or a certain position group that was your biggest takeaway for them coming out of signing day, what would that be?
Well, I was going to start with Joshua Lewis, but, Coach Sumrall, he had his moment on Sunday. Let me talk about one of their longest tenured commits, and that's Joshua Brantley. I think the most under-recruited player in Louisiana for this particular cycle. We've been aware of Josh since he was a freshman at Ruston, and for obvious reasons, and he's potentially, we're going to see him one more time before he hangs up his cleats and heads uptown permanently. But I just think that, a lot, I guess, like in high school recruiting, it's taken its toll when you're an athlete and you're not really sure what position you're going to play. But that dude makes plays. He makes them routinely. He tests out of the water. He's 6'3", 200 plus pounds with a 4.5 40. We already know that he can run the rock. He's a very physical runner. He's got great ability to see the field and attack it. I don't know if he's going to play receiver. I don't know if he's going to be like kind of a flex option. I don't know if he's going to eventually transition over to safety. I don't really care because he's got the skill set to do all of that. He is such a good playmaker. I love how Coach Summerall is recruiting. I think between Josh Lewis, Joshua Brantley, some of those guys that you mentioned, not only in state, but going out of state into Alabama, going to different parts. I mean, that's the recipe for Tulane to just have another great roster influx of talent. And I've heard Summerall's name get a little bit of buzz for this North Carolina job. I don't know if he'll take that because, one, he's got such a great roster at Tulane, not only there, but coming in. But he might be able to hold out for an even bigger job.
I'm going to tell my little brother you're apparently just a big fan of the name Josh, and so I'm sure he'll appreciate that if your two biggest takeaways are Josh Brantley and Josh Lewis. Brantley is going to be really interesting because you mentioned we don't know where he's going to end up on the field, and so I think that's going to be a fun storyline to watch with him throughout camp and whatnot when he does arrive to campus. Just, what's it going to look like? Where's he start working? And we've seen with a lot of guys where they start working might not be where they finish by the time the season rolls around. So how they utilize him is going to be fun to kind of track through the course of his early days uptown. Going out to Lafayette, the Cajuns announced 19 signees on Wednesday. And since I feel bad, since apparently I stole your first takeaway for Tulane there initially, I'll let you just kind of start with the Cajuns class and what your biggest takeaway for those guys were, whether it be a guy that you think is going to be really impressive there or a position group that you were impressed with the haul they brought in.
Yeah, I got I feel like I know who your guy is going to be. So my theme will be offense. Okay. Is that the same theme that you have? Yeah. So I'm going to go into the SIP. Record setting running back at Picayune Memorial is Daryl Smith. I think if he had another 2 inches in height, he might have more SEC offers. He might be staying in the SIP, if you catch my drift. This is a really talented runner from just outside of Louisiana. I loved it. Like I said, I think this guy could play at a higher level. He has been a workhorse for Picayune Memorial. It's great to see DeSormo and the staff continue to recruit the state well, but also, like LSU, dip into the Mississippis, the Texases, the Alabamas of the world, and get talent. Daryl Smith, I think, is going to be a really dynamic playmaker. UL already has a ton of great options in the backfield. This is going to continue, and I think the offensive side of the ball, not to say the defense doesn't look pretty good. They got a couple of studs on the defensive side of the ball, but I'm excited about the influx of talent heading on offense to Laffy.
I don't know if you knew that I was going to the defensive side, but I mean, for you, I feel like that if you go out of state, that's probably not the direction I'm heading. And so that was a pretty safe bet for you. They do have some other great pieces on offense. You might have thought I was going to talk about Russell Babineau, Trenton Chaney, and those guys. Versatile weapons certainly around there. But on defense, I've talked a lot throughout this cycle for the Cajuns about how much I like the in-state heavy defensive back group that they brought in, and they added another guy that we like an awful lot in Stephen Raynell from Central Baton Rouge down the stretch. And so when you add in a guy that I think had been under-recruited in Stephen, he's played a lot of corner at Central. They've announced him as a safety, which I think is probably the more natural direction he was heading. He's a a thickly built physical kid, also good ball skills. If anything's thrown his way, he's pretty much coming away with that. And I trust his instincts and intelligence on the back end of the defense potentially, but also a willingness to come down and help and run support. But you add that to Brent Gordon Jr. from Cecilia, a guy that I actually obviously have loved through his high school career and everything he brings to the table. He's kind of the flip side. He's been a safety that has been an absolute tackle monster for the Bulldogs, but I've seen him out at corner and get some work there where he is a much better cover a corner when called upon than I think he necessarily gets credit for, because that's not his role at the high school level. And so how they utilize him and some of the versatility he brings. And then on top of that, you had Cam Riley from Neville, Jaden Gloston from U High. They had an out-of-state addition in Kevin Malone. And so a group that is big in number and big in talent to me to bring in there to Lafayette and bolster that defense.
Yeah, we thought Ramel was going to end up at Tulane. We had seen him in week 1, and then we saw him uptown that weekend. Really talented player. You talk about UL taking him as a safety. We saw him not only play in the defensive backfield, but also see snaps at receiver. You love that playmaking from a potential safety. I think that's a diamond in the rough. I could see Stephen Ramel making plays in Laffy for several years. He's a very of the tiers in Louisiana, he's higher than people give him credit for.
Up in Ruston, Louisiana Tech added 13 in the early signing period under Coach Cumbie. This is obviously going to be a critical class for those guys. This year did not go quite the way that they had hoped, and so they're going to need an influx of some talent, both from the high school level and probably the portal here in the weeks to come. But when you look at these 13 guys that the Bulldogs announced on Wednesday, do you have a certain guy that you want to spotlight that you think I already actually, as I scroll down the list, know the answer to this question. A guy that you want to spotlight or a position group that you want to spotlight?
Yeah, I want to talk about the receiver that they added. And Dejon Smith, you got to see him sign yesterday. I've said it on this show. I've said it to you in person. I've said it to you on text. I've said it to Josh in text. I guess Joshua Brantley is not the most critically under-recruited player in the state because Dejon Smith did. The difference with Dejon is Dejon just started playing receiver this spring, got a full transition over the summer, and then broke absolutely hella loose as a senior playing receiver for Edna Carr. If and when we get to see him in the Superdome, there will be a package made about how damn good this kid is. I have spoken to multiple coaches in the SEC that believe that if the timing had worked out better, he could be playing for their rosters. He's 6 foot, 185 pounds. We talk about the potential that Teron Francis brings to that receiving core as a big play machine. He's got testing numbers out of the water and can jump out the gym and make absurd catches. Whereas Dejon does a lot of the number 2 receiver type of things, the underneath routes, the deep threats, the operating in space, and he's very smooth. He's got incredible hands, fantastic body control, and given that experience as a running back, you want the ball in his hands because he's just so a natural playmaker, and he's done that a ton for Carr this year. I don't think that they're playing in the semifinals if they don't have other receivers besides Manchild step up. They lost a ton of seniors last year. So for Dejon to learn a new position and excel this quickly, I hate to say this for Coach Cumbie. I hope he's got his earmuffs on. He's going to be in the portal this time next year because I think that SEC and other Power 4 teams are going to see him once he gets more exposure. It's just a lack of exposure issue. I take partial credit for that. But like he's insane. I think he is a bona fide Power 4 receiver heading up to Ruston. He's
a kid that I don't know how I ended up seeing some of his underclassmen clips from when he was at South Plaquemine. I think I was this is where I'm a maniac, but I was going through, I think, all district teams around the state and saying, oh, who's a kid that I haven't heard of? Let me go find some huddle, and was really impressed with him. And then didn't see him at South Plaquemine again and didn't know what the deal was. And then he ends up obviously at Carr, and he's playing at running back last year and then gets to his more natural position there at receiver this year. And we've both said it a couple times now, probably the most underrated, under-recruited guy in the state going into this year or the first half of this season before finally a couple of FCS offers came into play. And then just a few weeks ago, Louisiana Tech. And so I think an absolute steal for those guys, certainly. And a part of, shout out to that Edna Carr receiving room too. A guy we didn't talk as much about, Oliver Mitchell, heading to Tulane. And so you've got 3 in-state FBS signees from that group already. But the receiving group heading to Ruston was kind of my focal point as well. When you look at Dejon and then add Colby Thomas from Calvary Baptist and Johnny Thiel from Destrehan, 3 guys that have been phenomenal high school football players for their respective programs. And I think in all 3 cases probably have some of their best football ahead of them. And so looking forward to what they do in Ruston. And to your point, maybe a next stop even after Ruston, but, hopefully for Louisiana Tech and those fans that, what they see in front of them and potentially not just a year, but for years to come. Right down I-20, ULM announced its signing class, 13 new members. You're already kind of rolling your eyes a little bit. They announced 13 members of the program, new members of the program on Wednesday. It was a heavy JUCO flavor to this group. Only one in-state high school guy, and Fred Clark right there at Wasserman High, someone that we've watched a little bit. Our buddy Terrence Cahey over there, the coach of the Wildcats, making sure to promote his kids as well as anybody in the state. And so I think a really nice local addition for the Warhawks and Fred Clark. And I think credit to Coach Vincent and the job that they did this season to kind of take a step forward as a program and, have trust in him and what he's trying to do. But it has become a consistent theme with ULM that there's a level of frustration to not have more Louisiana guys, not have, whether it be local guys there in Northeast Louisiana or other guys around a pretty talent rich state. How much does that kind of frustrate you when we see that kind of signing class in and signing class out? And is there a reason to think that a coach could not go there and be successful in landing some more Louisiana talent?
Yeah, I think that's it's hard for me to comprehend. ULM has had a resurgent season. We've talked about it in the podcast. I got some money in my pocket from a couple of betting ULM to cover a couple of big spreads against them. This is not the same ULM that we're used to talking about. To think that they can't, I mean, look at when Willie Fritz got to Tulane, they were not recruiting the city of New Orleans at a very high clip, let alone the state of Louisiana. And you can say the same thing about when Billy Napier got to UL and the way that they started to really dig their feet in and find some gems in the state. To me, it's disappointing that ULM can't do the same thing. Not only do they have a monopoly, they don't have a monopoly. They have a very good footing in North Louisiana. There are gems that do not get recruited year in and year out. And they can go into South Louisiana. They can go into Mississippi and the DFW and East Texas. And to me, there's enough talent for them to have more than one in-state kid. Shout out to Coach Cahey. I'm glad that at least it was a Waspman kid that got to be that one kid. That makes sense. Coach Cahey's going to send a ton of kids to D1 and D2 schools over the next couple of years. He's a hell of a coach. Like you said, he promotes the heck out of his players. And to me, if I'm ULM, I'm calling Coach Cahey more. I'm calling West Monroe's head coach. I'm calling Neville. I'm trying to find these are players that at least need to have offers. And this number is not good for me. I imagine that they'll go through the portal, and I imagine that they're trying to restock the roster and of course add some Louisiana flavor. But to me, like, high school recruiting is suffering. So to see ULM sign one in-state kid, to me, that's a travesty, because if I sat down for an hour, I could give you, double-digit kids that you probably could have signed.
And again, this is more of a long-standing dynamic that I think we're frustrated with. We're not trying to come at Coach Vincent. He did a nice job taking a step forward with that program and really surprising a lot of folks, opening some eyes the first half of the season. And so I'm hoping that with what he's trying to do in kind of rebuilding and retooling this roster, that the fact that we're seeing some JUCO kids and theoretically about to see a notable transfer portal push, I'm hoping that's just kind of part of the step of restocking this roster overall. But I would like to see ULM do a better job of recruiting Louisiana when they do get to that point. And hopefully they do, man. Hopefully they feel like they're in a place where they can attack the high school ranks that much better. And when they do, hopefully they're recruiting Louisiana better than we've seen multiple tenures there do so. And yeah, that's certainly something that we've talked about repeatedly through the years and would love to see change here moving forward.
We should send some merch up to Monroe. Recruit that boot. Just a little bit of advice, and subscribe while you're at it.
There you go. Mentioned we're not going to get into the FCS programs as much. I think Northwestern State and Southeastern Louisiana were the two that kind of announced some of their signees. We've talked about heading out to Hammond, Kyrie Paul, the fantastic playmaker from Estruma, a kid we've talked about a little bit. Ben Taylor, the prolific passer from Airline, was who's kind of, I think, the big name or the face of the five signees that Northwestern State announced yesterday. But a lot is still to be announced and whatnot for all of the FCS programs around the state. And so we'll kind of keep an eye on that. But mentioned at the beginning, one of the big stories of the state, a guy who's heading out of state, Jahkeem Stewart. We want to make sure that we talk about that. He's heading to USC. I don't know. Has there been a high school signee from Louisiana go to USC since Joe McKnight?
Yeah. I am so disappointed in you.
Who am I forgetting?
Well, I don't want to call Brett McCormick right on this podcast, but his name is Tackett Curtis.
Oh yeah, duh. Not that worked out Great for
And
USC.
because we started on Carr, Speedy Noyle almost signed with USC before A&M.
Well, look, there have been some almost. Coy Moore was committed to USC.
That's true. That's true.
And that's why that stuck into my mind, is because when we were first starting TigerDetails.com, I wrote a long feature announcing Coy's commitment, talking about him going to follow Joe McKnight's footsteps and being the first Louisiana kid to commit out there and forever. And yeah, so that's my apologies to Tackett for forgetting that. Obviously, Tackett
He's keeping receipts. He's keeping receipts.
But he's also not keeping those receipts in Southern California right now. As was part of the dynamic at play.
No, he's in beautiful Madison.
But a win for Coach Henderson and company out there to get a New Orleans guy, a guy that finishes up his high school academic career at Edna Carr. Jahkeem Stewart was one of the big national storylines, and he heads out of state to USC. And I know some LSU fans are frustrated with that, and that is what it is. But as you kind of wrap up the Jahkeem Stewart recruiting saga and look at him heading out to Los Angeles, what were your takeaways of how this played out and what the Trojans get in Jahkeem?
Yeah, well, anyone who listens to Recruit That Boot, I would also implore you to go to NOLA.com, subscribe there too, and read Jeff Duncan's piece where Jared and I both gave expertise on Jahkeem Stewart's recruitment. But I think, long story short, it was one of the more polarizing recruitments that either one of us have come across in our time doing this. So much uniqueness, so many circumstances that we've never actually seen come into play for this particular decision. But between the lack of high school experience, he's played 12 varsity games at St. Aug. He transfers and is set to graduate later this month from Edna Carr without ever playing a game for them as a senior, to go out of state in a recruitment that Ohio State was the leader at one point, Oregon was the leader at some point, USC was the leader, LSU made it very close down the stretch, and then USC holds on. To me, it has the ability to be a polarizing recruitment down the road because this kid has all the talent in the world. He could turn out to be a first round pick and nobody would be surprised, because physically, college coaches in the SEC have called him a generational talent. He is 6'6", 285 pounds. Nobody should be able to move with the twitch and intensity that Jahkeem does move with. And he's physically dominant, with a fantastic work ethic. And when he has been on the field, whether it's in a camp setting or with pads on for the Purple Knights, he's been excellent. The issue, and this is someone who has been doing this for a long time, especially evaluating top-level players, is without the senior year, and there have been plenty of examples of kids that have been just fine, Malik Neighbors being one of them, but to me, Jahkeem is so new in his football experience that the lack of a senior season, it just creates a massive question mark for what he'll turn into when he gets to USC. And part of the reason that Eric Henderson and the Trojans won this battle is because USC desperately needs defensive linemen to come to LA and play. And Jahkeem will be there in about 1 month, and he'll be in the weight room. And I won't be surprised if he's 300 pounds by the time USC opens up. I think they play LSU. Do they play LSU again? Or is that a 1-year thing?
Oh, go ahead. Keep talking. I'm going to look it up. If it's this, they play them again, but I don't remember if it's back-to-back years or if it's a subsequent year.
So by the time that USC starts, there's a very good chance that Jahkeem is starting on the defensive line. And to me, he's going to have to pour everything and then some in to be actually ready for that moment. Because to me, that's almost an impossible task to get someone who has now not been playing real football for, well over a year, or a year and a half by that point, to come into a college atmosphere, to be coached to be ready to play in the Big Ten 6 months into your college career, when technically you should be getting ready for your senior season. So to me, there's a massive hurdle to overcome for Jahkeem. But of course, because of those physical gifts, it's hard to say that it's impossible. I can see this going in so many different directions. I think that we all just need to have our popcorn ready to see how it turns out, because it's going to be an interesting road to see if and when he is starting for USC in a couple of months and what that looks like for the Trojans under Eric Henderson, who, yes, of course, coached Aaron Donald.
He's a kid that, for folks that haven't met him, and I mean, to some of the point of why this has been an interesting process is we've seen so little of him on Friday nights. And so when Jeff was writing that story and asking, why haven't we seen more kind of features and talking about who this young man is, the way when we were all at NOLA.com together and covering Leonard Fournette from the time he was a middle school student athlete. It was so much has happened kind of more behind the traditional scenes. We saw more of him on the camp circuit than we did at, in high school games. And so, and then obviously losing the year because of his transfer of schools and losing the year because he reclassed up. And so we just saw less of him and people knew less about him. And in that process, he had less experience on the football field in some big games in the Catholic League or wherever he would have played. And so folks that don't know him as well, he is an awesome kid to be around, really great personality off the field and very easy to root for. And I think we both really hope that it works out at the highest possible level for him. It's just, to use your term, it's more of a question mark for fans to wonder, okay, we haven't seen as much of it. And so it's always an inexact science. You never know how a guy is going to pan out. You never know how any given day of anyone's life is going to go. But for him, there's less of a track record and proof of concept for folks to have seen. And so you're in wait and see mode a little bit, but he does have all of the talent in the world, and it would be awesome to see him, even though it's not in purple and gold, go realize all of that in a really big way in Los Angeles.
That's exactly right, though. I think there is just plenty of there's a big gap of what's missing from the puzzle that is Jahkeem Stewart's recruitment and evaluation. And without your senior season, it opens the door for a lot more questions, or maybe it's a bigger hurdle to overcome. So we're going to see what he is really made out of, to see what it's looking like, because USC is paying transfer portal money to bring Jahkeem Stewart there. He is getting paid with the best defensive lineman in college football without ever playing a senior season varsity snap or a college snap. But USC is relying on him to be what we are projecting him to be. But projections are dangerous. He has the talent. He has the work ethic. We got to see it all come together now.
And yeah, that need and that spotlight just intensifies the level of, of whether it be credit or criticism or whatever from a fan base out there that's going to have really, really high expectations for him right off the bat in what would have been theoretically his senior year in terms of his age. And so we'll watch how it all pans out there for Jahkeem heading out there. It's certainly an exciting day for the USC fans right now to add him to the program and have a chance to be the ones that get that firsthand view of one of the most talented kids in this class on a national scale. But Samuel, I know you got to get the heck out of here, so I appreciate your time, man. I don't know if you have anything else to add before you jet.
No, it's been a great season. It's been a great run at Recruit That Boot. And next week, we have to figure out when we're going to record. We have to record early next week because I'm coming to that boot.
State championship games next week. We'll talk more about that shortly. Again, he's Sam Spiegelman. I'm Jet Roser. This is Louisiana versus all y'all's Recruit That Boot. Thank y'all for tuning in. And until next time, y'all be well.